Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into a story that starts in a place we all know, a place of supposed safety and comfort, the family home. We're going to peel back the floral wallpaper of a seemingly normal life to find the rot festering in the walls beneath. It's a story about a quiet promise that curdles into a deadly lie, about how the people closest to you can become the most terrifying strangers. It's a journey into the heart of a darkness that doesn't announce itself with a bang, but with a slow, creeping silence. And let's be very real for a moment. When the monster is someone who sleeps down the hall, you might not survive this. So, before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead and post your city and the time where you are in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're all listening from. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for some gentle white noise, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. The first thing that hit Nina was the cold. It radiated from the bathroom tiles, a stark, unforgiving chill that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the air. When she threw open the door, the scene was frozen in a kind of awful tableau. Her mother, Marianne, was on the floor, a crumpled figure against the white and gray squares. Her eyes were open, staring at the ceiling with a vacant finality. Her face was waxy, her lips bruised and bloody from the fall, and right next to her a single strange detail, a wet washcloth, neatly and carefully folded. Walter had handed it to her, you see. That was his contribution before he left, before he walked out, leaving her alone, knowing, just knowing, she was going to fall. It wasn't an accident. It was a test. It all went back to a promise. One of those little sentences that should have evaporated into thin air, but instead took root and became a cornerstone of a life.
I will always be for you.
He'd said it so casually one ordinary evening, years and years ago. There was no grand occasion, no swelling music. Rain was pattering against the window panes, and the air inside was thick with that comfortable familiarity that settles over a long marriage like a layer of fine, invisible dust. Yet the sentence stuck. For Marianne, it became an internal vow she carried through 4 decades, through the births of 2 children, through quiet nights and loud days, through all the years when things just worked, without anyone needing to talk about it. Marianne was a doer, the kind of woman who was the silent, unthanked engine of the family. She organized the daily chaos. She cared for Walter's aging parents without complaint. She was the load-bearing wall holding the entire structure together, and she never made a fuss. She performed the emotional labor for their entire family for 40 years, a debt he seemingly had no intention of ever repaying. Walter, on the other hand, was the quiet one. He was the king of non-interference, content to let things run their course as long as his own routine wasn't disturbed. His emotional availability had all the warmth of a forgotten ice cream sandwich. Their roles were never spoken aloud, but the system worked. For a long, long time. Then the trembling began. At first, it was just a faint, barely perceptible tremor in her hand, easy to dismiss as tiredness or caffeine, but soon it became a persistent, undeniable shaking that she couldn't hide or control. The doctor, in his sterile, brightly lit office, gave a preliminary diagnosis with a chillingly neutral tone. He might as well have been reading the weather report. Marianne was silent. She didn't need the medical jargon or the gentle, condescending pamphlets. She knew, even without the explanations, what this meant. She understood the path that was now laid out before her. Interestingly, when the physician James Parkinson first documented the condition in 1817, he called it the shaking palsy, a name that sounds almost quaintly Victorian now, completely belying the relentless, degenerative reality of the disease. While Marianne fought to maintain control over a body that was slowly betraying her, Walter began to retreat. It wasn't a sudden break, no dramatic slamming of doors. It was a quiet erosion of intimacy, a slow, invisible slide out of their shared life. There were no fights, no loud words, just a daily deficit, of glances, of gestures, of attention. Marianne felt it deeply. She sensed it wasn't just her illness that was pushing him away. It was as if he'd already found another place to be, somewhere she didn't know and wasn't allowed to enter. Their life together continued on the surface, a stable-looking facade, but the inside had been hollowed out, leaving nothing but a fragile shell. This story isn't about a crime of passion. It's about a crime that began with a lie that spread like a crack in a foundation over years. It's not about a murder in the heat of the moment, but a meticulously, cruelly patient plan. Marianne had felt it long before she had proof. She'd never been the type to run to a doctor for every little thing. She was reliable, disciplined in both body and mind. But one of those quiet afternoons, as she struggled just to place a coffee cup on a tray without it rattling, she understood this wasn't just fatigue. Something deep inside her had been thrown off its axis. The official diagnosis of Parkinson's came after months of uncertainty. The neurologist said the word with such professional calm, as if it were no more serious than high blood pressure. Marianne sat beside Walter, wrapped in her beige coat, her hands folded in her lap, feeling like a spectator at a play that was about someone else. Walter asked a few questions, his voice calm, almost distant. He asked about medication, the progression, the prognosis. He never once looked at her, he never reached for her hand. The old philosophers used to say that a man is only as good as his word, but Walter seemed to be operating on a heavily revised beta version of that philosophy. In the weeks that followed the diagnosis, the silence in the house grew teeth. On the surface, nothing had changed. They still had breakfast together, ran errands, and did the housework. It looked like a perfectly functional marriage, the kind you might see in an ad for sensible Swedish furniture. But a new, unspoken tension now lay between all their mundane activities. Walter was physically present, sure, but his mind, his spirit, was somewhere else entirely. In the mornings, he'd make the coffee just as he always had, but his gaze would be fixed out the window, or more often on the flickering screen of his phone, as if the glowing display were more alive than the woman sitting across from him. "You don't look at me anymore," Marianne said one evening. Her voice was flat, toneless, a simple statement of fact. Walter looked up, startled for a fraction of a second, as if he'd forgotten she was there. "Yes, I do," he said. And that was it. He went back to his food. Marianne didn't press. She wasn't a complainer. But her world was becoming more difficult. The tremor was worse, her gait more unsteady. The house she knew so intimately, the home she had built, was becoming a landscape of tripping hazards. She started to navigate it by touch, her hands trailing along walls and furniture for support, a slow, careful choreography that became her new normal. Walter noticed. Of course he noticed. But he said nothing. Instead, he started going for walks. At first it was just on Sundays, then weekdays, too. They got longer. "Fresh air," he'd say. "I need to clear my head." "Sure you do, pal. About as much as a fish needs a bicycle." Marianne would just nod, her eyes empty. She wondered if he'd ever really come back, not just his body, but his heart. She remembered years ago how he would sometimes sit in his armchair for hours after work, staring into the middle distance, as if searching for something he knew he'd never find in that room. The first concrete clue came, as they so often do, in the most banal of places. The supermarket. Marianne was standing in front of the jams and preserves, trying to decide between apricot and strawberry, when a woman came to stand beside her. A woman from town, a bit younger, with a friendly smile. "Gabriele." "Your husband was telling me about the tremor," Gabriele said, her voice casual, her eyes fixed on a jar of honey. It was a verbal drive-by, about as subtle as a foghorn in a library. A chill went through Marianne. Walter had never, not once, mentioned talking to anyone else about her illness. That evening, she heard him on the phone in the kitchen. It wasn't a normal conversation. The tone was different. It was intimate, conspiratorial. When she walked into the room, he ended the call abruptly, tossing the phone onto the counter. Nothing important, he said, reaching for a glass of water as if to swallow down the unspoken words. Marianne turned and walked out without a word. She knew. You know how you just know? There's an old saying that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but it forgets to mention the cold, quiet clarity of a woman betrayed, which is a much scarier, much more patient animal. It wasn't just the illness anymore. Something was fundamentally, deeply wrong. It felt like finally noticing a shadow that had been living in the house all along. The breaking point arrived on a gray Thursday morning. Marianne had barely slept. The tremor in her hands was violent. Her legs felt like lead. Walter had left early, mumbling something about an errand. When he returned, he left his phone lying on the kitchen table, a careless, arrogant mistake. Marianne was in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, when the screen lit up. A message preview from Gabriele. I can still smell you. Tell her the truth already. I want all of you. She didn't need to read anymore. The letters burned into her mind. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was a fact, sharp and cold. Neurologically speaking, our brains process the pain of social rejection and betrayal in the very same regions that process physical pain. What Marianne felt wasn't just heartbreak, it was a deep physical wound. When Walter came in a moment later with 2 cups of tea, she looked at him and smiled, a blank, hollow smile, containing neither warmth nor accusation. Thank you, she said. He nodded, sat down, picked up his phone, and read the message. Marianne watched, her own body entering a state of what psychologists call psychic numbing, a defense mechanism against overwhelming trauma. She saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile flicker across his lips. Hours passed. The world outside grew dark. Walter was supposedly in the garden, tending to the shed. She felt an urge to move, to escape the pain pinning her to the chair. With immense effort, she tried to stand. Her legs buckled. She tried again. They failed. On the 3rd attempt, she lost her balance completely. She fell slowly without resistance, as if her body had finally given up the fight. The impact was a dull thud. Then silence. Her limbs wouldn't obey. A deep cold spread through her, starting in her feet and creeping upward. Time melted. It was Nina who found her. The bathroom light was still on, and there was her mother. Eyes open, face pale. Mom! Nina cried, dropping to her knees, her own hands shaking as she fumbled for a pulse. Walter appeared about half an hour later. His gaze drifted from Marianne on the floor to his distraught daughter. I was only gone for a moment, he said, his voice utterly flat, devoid of any shock or concern. But Marianne, even in her dazed state, knew the truth. He had been gone for a very, very long time. The hospital was a world of bleached white and muted beeps. Marianne lay in a bed that was cranked up too high, making her look small and fragile against the starched linens. Her skin was almost translucent. A kind-faced doctor spoke in soothing tones, assuring Nina that there was no acute decline, that the fall hadn't caused any new neurological damage. But Marianne wasn't really listening to the words, only the tone. She already knew it wasn't just the disease eating away at her, it was something else, something far more corrosive. While his wife was suspended in this antiseptic limbo, Walter sprang into action. He became, overnight, the model of a concerned husband. He announced to Nina that he'd be out with friends for a bit, a statement so bizarrely casual it set off alarm bells, but his main focus was on performative care. He had handrails installed in the bathroom with the speed of a seasoned contractor. Seriously, he went from zero to Bob the Builder in about 6 hours. He spoke with the doctors,
took meticulous notes, and asked intelligent questions, but his efforts felt rehearsed, mechanical. It was like he was following a protocol, one designed not for genuine care but for self preservation. He was building an alibi, not a safer home. Nina watched all of this with a growing knot of dread in her stomach. She decided to go back to the house. The official reason she gave her father was that she wanted to tidy up and scan some old family photos for her mom. A harmless, daughterly task. The house was exactly as she remembered, a museum of their life, kept in perfect order by Walter. But its pristine condition now felt sterile, empty. On the old desk in her parents' bedroom sat her mother's laptop. It was dusty, neglected, but functional. Nina packed it up. Later that night, alone, she pounded on
The old operating system whirred to life, probably running on Windows 98 in pure hubris. She started clicking through folders, looking for the pictures she'd promised to find, but she found much more. Deep in the file structure, she discovered folders with strange names, encrypted files, and videos. Much of it was hidden, but some of it was just there, openly accessible. As if Walter was so confident in his control over his world that he didn't even feel the need to be careful. The ancient Greeks believed that hubris, or excessive pride, was a crime that would always be punished by the gods. Walter, it seemed, had an overdue appointment with Nemesis. She clicked open a video file. The screen filled with the image of a dimly lit room she didn't recognize. A woman sat on a chair, shoulders slumped, crying silently. And then she heard a voice. It was calm, controlled, almost friendly. It was her father's voice. Nina's hand froze on the touchpad. She clicked on another file and then another. She saw fragments of other lives, other women, women with downcast eyes and tear-streaked faces. She saw Gabrielle, the woman from the supermarket, sitting on a chair staring blankly at a spot on the wall. Then another face surfaced, one that made the blood drain from Nina's. It was a woman she recognized from a missing person poster that had been plastered all over town 2 years ago. No one had ever connected her father to that case. For years, Nina had felt a low-grade sense of confusion about her family's dynamic, that feeling that her perceptions were always slightly off. She realized now what it was. A classic case of prolonged gaslighting, where she was subtly made to question her own reality. She wasn't crazy. She had been right all along. In one video, the most chilling of all, her father stood next to a weeping woman, his arms crossed, his face a mask of indifference. Then he spoke, his voice smooth and steady. "You thought you understood me. But now you weep. And I laugh." A violent shiver ran down Nina's spine, followed by a surge of white-hot rage that made her feel sick. How had she lived with this man, called him dad, and seen nothing? How could the man who read her bedtime stories be the same one speaking these monstrous words? She fought the urge to smash the laptop, to delete every trace. But a cold, clear purpose settled over her. She didn't copy anything. She didn't save anything. She knew that digital forensics can recover data ghosts from even deleted files. The original device was the key. Instead, she grabbed a pen and paper and carefully wrote down the file paths to the most damning videos. A little insurance policy, just in case something were to get lost. That same night, she walked into the local police station and handed the laptop over to the officer at the desk. She said almost nothing, just the bare minimum required to explain what it was and who it belonged to. Afterwards, she sat in her car in the parking lot for a long time, the engine off, staring at the sterile lights of the station. The silence was absolute. 2 days later, they came for Walter. It was early in the morning. He opened the door, asked no questions, and packed no bag. He didn't resist or argue. He just went with them, as if he'd been expecting this moment his entire life. The interrogation room was exactly what you'd expect. Gray walls, a scuffed metal table, 2 chairs designed for maximum discomfort. and a camera in the corner, a single unblinking eye. It was a room stripped of all personality, a beige box designed to make people confess. Walter sat with his back straight, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. He looked less like a man accused of horrific crimes and more like a bored executive waiting for his latte order. His gaze was fixed on some invisible point on the wall opposite, utterly still, as if concentrating on a problem only he could see.
For over 2 hours, the investigators laid it all out. They walked him through the evidence from the laptop. Names, dates, documents, and of course the videos. They had enough to put him away for centuries. They showed him images of the women, including the ones who were still officially listed as missing, women whose families had been suspended in a hell of unknowing for years. They had him. It was open and shut. Any normal person would break down, lawyer up, or start shouting. Walter did none of the above. He just sat there, emanating a silence that was more unnerving than any confession. It wasn't a defiant silence. It was complete, contained. The lad detective was a woman in her 50s, sharp and experienced. She'd seen every kind of liar, from the blubbering messes to the stone-cold sociopaths. But Walter was different. His calm was a fortress. She pushed, patiently. "Mr. B," she said, her voice even, "we have a significant amount of incriminating material. You know what's on these files. You know what we know." He didn't even look at her. Nothing. It was only when she brought up the woman who had vanished without a trace years ago, mentioning that the last person she was seen with was a man matching his description, that something finally shifted. He slowly, deliberately lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was steady. No tremor, no uncertainty, but there was an undertone in it that made the seasoned detective pause. "You believe I was alone?" he asked. The detective's brow furrowed. She didn't respond immediately, letting the question hang in the stale air. "This," Walter continued, a strange new energy in his voice, "was never a solo act." Now he looked directly at her. There was no defiance in his eyes, no challenge. It was something closer to relief, as if he was finally getting to unburden himself of a secret he was tired of carrying by himself. "Do you really think I could have done all of that on my own for years?"
Manipulate them, control them, make them disappear without anyone noticing a thing? The detective leaned forward slightly. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The poet John Donne famously wrote that no man is an island, and it turns out, for Walter, that was terrifyingly true. He needed a whole other continent for his psychopathy. "My friend Manfred was there from the beginning," Walter said, his voice now taking on a narrative quality, like he was telling a story he'd rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. "He was my mirror, my counterpart. I was the quiet one, the observer. Manfred, he was the wiry one, the charmer. He could talk his way into anywhere. He had the charisma I lacked. He got close where I kept my distance. We've known each other since we were kids, a couple of outsiders who found a strange kind of understanding in each other." He was describing a classic psychological condition, first identified by French psychiatrists in the 1800s. It's called folie à deux, a madness of two, where delusion is shared and reinforced by a pair of individuals, usually in close, isolated contact. Walter and Manfred were a textbook case. "He taught me that control is more than just power," Walter went on, leaning back in his chair now, not relaxed, but unburdened. The mask was off. He wasn't trying to save himself anymore. He was trying to explain his art. "It's a game. A game you always win if you know the rules." "What does that mean, exactly?" the detective asked, her voice low. "One of us would make the approach. Charming, harmless, attentive. The other would watch from a distance. It was never random. It was always planned. Eventually, the women would trust us. They'd open up, tell us things they'd never told anyone, and that's when the game would begin. For me, it was an escape from a life that was suffocating me, an escape from a marriage where I felt invisible. Each of these women gave me something I couldn't get at home, the feeling of being seen, of being needed, of being powerful. And how did it end? The detective asked. It ended when we ended it, Walter said simply. No drama, no warning. Based on Walter's detailed confession, Manfred R. was arrested that same day. The police found him at the small workshop he ran on the edge of town, where he worked as a self-employed handyman. When the officers read him the warrant, he just smiled. A faint, unsettling smirk. It was just a game, he said. The day of the trial was bitter cold. A small crowd had gathered on the steps of the courthouse. Journalists smelling blood in the water, a few morbid curiosity seekers, and the families of the victims. Some held framed photos of their missing daughters and sisters. Others just stood with a hollowed-out look in their eyes. Inside the courtroom, the silence was thick and heavy. Marianne sat in the back row, a frail figure wrapped in a thick coat, with Nina beside her. The tremor in her hands was impossible to miss. Walter and Manfred were led in by several officers. They were cuffed and controlled, moving with a placid calm that was deeply unsettling. As was standard procedure for this part of the hearing, their handcuffs were removed once they were seated. The courtroom was considered secure, though in hindsight, it was about as secure as a screen door on a submarine. The chaos that followed wasn't physical. It was a precisely engineered psychological assault. Walter began to speak, his voice loud and clear, ringing with a bizarre kind of confidence you see in people suffering from a profound Dunning-Kruger effect. So utterly incompetent at being human that they're blissfully unaware of their own failings. He showed no remorse. Instead, he painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of a world that just couldn't understand complex men like him. It wasn't a threat, it was a provocation, a final performance designed to seize control of the narrative. The room shifted uncomfortably. Then Manfred, who had been silent until now, leaned into his microphone. A quiet, almost broken sentence slipped out. You never thought someone like me could do this, did you? It wasn't a boast. In that one moment, it sounded almost like regret, not for what he'd done, but for what he'd revealed himself to be. But it was too late. All hell broke loose. Shouting erupted from the gallery. The officers swarmed the defendants, hustling them out of the courtroom. The judge hammered his gavel, and the proceedings were abruptly suspended. The trial would later continue, but quietly, under a media blackout, with the public shut out. What happened in that courtroom was a spectacular failure. It turned out that internal reports had previously flagged both Walter and Manfred as highly manipulative, but these warnings weren't taken seriously enough. This wasn't just an oversight, it was a textbook case of institutional betrayal, where the very system designed to provide justice fails the people it's meant to protect. What trickled out to the public and to the victims came days later. There was no public commentary. The official statement was a masterpiece of bureaucratic jargon, speaking of an emotionally escalated incident without naming names or giving details. The victims' families were contacted individually, in quiet rooms, where officials speaking in soft, empathetic tones essentially asked for their silence. It was less a conscious cover-up and more the system's reflexive instinct for self-preservation. There were promises of learning from mistakes, of reviewing security protocols. Then came the offer. Not compensation, they stressed. It was a symbolic gesture, a one-time payment of 5,000 euros. A token of sympathy, they called it. It was an amount of money so insulting it was comical, barely enough to cover a lifetime supply of therapy donuts. Marianne refused the money. She didn't want a gesture. She wanted a time machine. Nina, however, struggled with it. She would sit alone at night, staring at old family photos, wondering if taking the money could have bought back even a sliver of her mother's stolen dignity. But she knew it couldn't. No amount could fill the void Walter had carved into their lives. Years passed. Marianne eventually died, passing away quietly in the same house where she had spent a lifetime with a man whose promise of love was just a long, slow-acting poison. Her final years were lived in retreat, cared for by Nina, wrapped in a silence that was more about protection than loneliness. She rarely spoke of what happened, not out of shame, but from the deep, weary knowledge that some experiences are only made heavier by words. As she once whispered to Nina in a moment of devastating clarity, "I felt it, but I wanted him to love me anyway." What Walter and Manfred did was more than a series of crimes. It was the systematic destruction of trust, the deliberate weaponizing of intimacy, that their reign of terror was tolerated, overlooked, or willfully ignored for so long, reveals a failure that goes far beyond two evil men. It points to an entire pattern of looking away, and so the question Marianne's story leaves behind hangs in the air. How long do we keep looking away before we finally force ourselves to see? If you have any thoughts on this case, please share them in the comments below. Not because it's easy, but because every voice matters. The story of Marianne and Walter is a harrowing journey into the quiet corners where darkness takes root. Not in abandoned alleys or shadowy woods, but in the familiar carpeted hallways of a family home. It serves as a chilling reminder that the most profound betrayals are often perpetrated not by monstrous strangers, but by those to whom we have given the keys to our lives, the architects of our daily comfort. The slow erosion of Marianne's world, mirrored by the gradual decay of her own body, speaks to a horror that is patient, methodical, and devastatingly intimate. It's a narrative that forces us to confront the terrifying possibility that we may not truly know the people we love, and that the foundation of trust upon which we build our lives can be a fragile, hollow thing. As we leave this story behind, let the silence that follows be filled not with fear, but with a renewed sense of awareness. Let us hold our own loved ones a little closer and listen a little more intently to the unspoken words that drift through the quiet rooms of our own homes. May you find peace in your surroundings tonight, and may the gentle sounds of your own world be a source of genuine comfort and security. Rest well.